Hey folks, welcome back. So, having shown you through the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition starter set, I wanted to give you a quick look at the Slipcase Set, which I actually got this from the original Kickstarter for 7th edition. I understand there's been several errata updates and stuff since then, but nothing major has been changed, so I've held on to this one. Probably should upgrade it at some point, just to make sure I've got all my ducks in a row and don't miss any key rules mistakes, but I really haven't seen anything that's affected any of my games so far. And it's a beautiful package. As you can see, you get this wonderful image of Cthulhu tearing up the sea on the front. Along the back here, we've got this classic logo for the game, the Elder sign, and the Chaosium Inc. logo as well. And on the back, we have another image, which we will find on the Investigator's Handbook. And you see three people trudging towards a great idol of one of the outer gods. So, sure that whatever happens, it's not going to be great. And then inside, you have your Keeper Rulebook, which is kind of the complete rule set, the Investigator Handbook, which has more stuff for players, and the Keeper Screen, which includes a bunch of extra stuff besides the Keeper Screen for all your needs as a Keeper. So we'll start off with just a quick flip through of each. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the rules and stuff because, I mean, you pretty much get the basics from the starter set, and all of this is just building on that framework. So yeah, you can see the Keeper Rulebook shares the image with one side of the slipcase, and the Investigator Rulebook is on the other side. So nice unity of design there. They've got, of course, lovely bookmarks, really well constructed hardbacks. I mean, I've had these books since 2013, so full on 10 years, and they are pretty much as new. I mean, they're really, really solidly built, and it's that way with all their hardcovers. Honestly, I've had no trouble with any bindings coming apart, nothing like that. They're really, really well made, and in full color and beautiful. And there, of course, we have H.P. Lovecraft. So the Keeper Rulebook is a bit bigger because it includes things like the Bestiary and so forth. But again, we're just going to kind of quickly flip through. The TOC gives you a basic outline of what's in here, of course. We've got, what's the game about? If you're an RPGer already, you can kind of skip through that. Then there's some background into Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos, which is not just Lovecraft, but included several other writers who were sort of in his circle or were later inspired by him. Then there is some rules for character creation, then full skill list, then the game system itself. Then we get into a separate chapter for combat, a few pages on running chases, then a whole bunch of stuff on sanity, which is lots of fun. Chapter on magic, so that's where you find scary Mythos tome and learn dark spells that can do amazing things but enact a cost in terms of sanity and magic points generally. Then how to run the game, basically. So how to build scenarios, how to run NPCs, using idea rolls to help players who are stuck, stuff like that. Then there's a list of the various tomes that they might find in the game. We have a Grimoire of Spells, which is expanded in another book that I'll show you at a later video. Some examples of artifacts and alien devices. Then we've got the Bestiary of Monsters, Beasts, and Gods. Then we've got two intro scenarios, amidst the ancient trees and the crimson letters. And then various appendices. So a glossary, how to convert stuff to 7th edition rules, which is much easier than you would imagine if you have older stuff from previous editions. Key equipment from the 1920s, key equipment for the modern era, weapons table, rules summary sheets, and then investigator sheets for the 20s and the modern time. So it's a big fat book, well over 400 pages. They really give you a lot of background info here. It's a really nice long example of play, some example stories you should read as a keeper to kind of get you in the mood of how the system works, and really freakish artwork throughout, which I always love. Then we've got the background on the mythos, which is helpful if you're unfamiliar with the kind of Cthulhuid gaming paradigm. Basically, the idea is cosmic horror. Lovecraft felt that the deepest fear was that fear of the unknown. We live in an uncaring and hostile universe, and there could be beings out there that treat us like we treat ants. We don't think about them, we just stomp on them without care. And to an ant, our motivations are unknowable, and he liked to imagine beings that were like that to us. Then we get into character creation. Then we have some hot tips as well for the GM, like, if somebody rolls really badly, is that necessarily bad? And the answer is not necessarily. I'm working out attributes. Then we have an extended version of the damage bonus and build table, because some monsters you will find later have very large build numbers. Then you work out the occupation. We have a beautiful reference here to the full character sheet, which includes space for your backstory, gear and possessions, cash and assets, some quick reference rules for rolls, wounds, and healing, and you can note your fellow investigators' names down there as well, so you don't forget who you're playing with. So a really nice layout here. Then working out what the numbers mean in terms of real world comparators. So a constitution of 200 plus means that, like, you're talking about gods and stuff. A size above 200 is, above 1,920 pounds. 150 is a horse or a cow, all that kind of stuff. So if you have a low power, it means you're weak-willed. A high power means you have an iron will, strong connection to the unseen world in the spiritual realm. And then we have an example, sort of character creation, to kind of walk through that. And then we have some sample occupations that they can choose from. So, for example, professor, Lovecraftian, they'll get library use, other language, own language, psychology, any other 4 skills as academic or personal specialties. A credit rating between 20 and 70. And their occupation and skill points will be their education level times 4. So there's so many different ways you can build a character in this game to get a really personalized experience. I mean, there's so many different possible ways you can distribute characteristics and attach those to different careers. You can give them meaningful locations, treasured possessions, sort of weaknesses, special traits, like they might be good with animals, have a good reputation, ambitious, ladies' man or seductress, etc. Then you want to equip them with stuff. So then they give you a walkthrough of what the credit rating means and how you determine cash and assets from your credit rating and your kind of spending level that you can get through per day. And then they give you some other options for character creation, like the quickfire method, which is in the starter set, basically. You can do point buy, do all kinds of stuff. And if you go to the Doll's House, which is now the official online character creator for Call of Cthulhu, you can choose any of the different methods to make up your characters, and then it'll print out an official, nicely formatted character sheet for whatever era you choose. And now we have our example character, Harvey Walters, all fully made up. So he's a journalist. He's really into archaeology, apparently. He's got a pretty decent credit rating at 41, so he's kind of lower middle class. He's not great at fighting, and he knows nothing about shooting, but he's good at understanding the law, library use, which are often very useful, and he's very persuasive and good with human psychology, as well as language. So he's a good one to go out and talk to people and help you get information that you need, which is what a journalist would do. Then we have our chapter on skills. So we're talking again about what do they mean? If you're from 1 to 5%, you have no idea what you're doing, basically. 6 is 19%, you kind of got a small amount of knowledge. 20 to 49, you're an amateur. 50 to 74, you're a professional, so you could basically make a living from that skill. 75 to 89 means you're an expert, so that means you've got like a master's or a PhD equivalent level. 90 plus means you're among the world's best. It's rare that you'll get 90 pluses, but you can eventually reach those heights if you have a character live long enough. Then we've got a full skill list. In the brackets, you'll see everybody has like a default value in these skills, which is written in the brackets there. So if you don't buy any points, you have a sort of default value to roll against. Some of them are really low, like astronomy, you get 1% because it's a difficult science. But other things, like climb, which are more universal, you get a little bit more points in there. You get 20% as a default. So you got more to work with at the beginning. So they go through all the skills, examples of their use. Another thing you can do, by the way, in 7th edition is you can push your rolls, and they give examples of that. So pushing your roll means you failed the first roll, and you want to try again, and the GM can allow you to push the roll. That means you roll again, you explain how you're approaching it differently, and then if you fail, you are given an extra consequence or complication. For computer use, for example, which is one of the modern skills, if you push the roll, then, perhaps you're taking longer to develop your program, you're using another's code to make a shortcut and try a different way around, or using a virus or something to exploit the system. So it's giving you examples of ways to, approach a situation differently for each skill, which is really helpful. And also you can use those as tips to give out to players if they're struggling on how to think of how to use their skills or what they want to do when they push. Also gives you guidance for when to use the regular difficulty, which is just roll under the skill, and hard difficulty, which is when they need to roll under the hard level to have a success. So it's a really comprehensive chapter on all the skills, as you can see, and very handy for keepers and players. Oh, we got a brain in tube. Not where you want to end up in life, generally speaking. And then we get into the actual game system, and we're in some horrible nightmarescape here with an impaled skeleton and various terrible things beyond. So we know the basics of this already, essentially, from the starter set. You've got regular difficulty, hard difficulty, and extreme difficulty, and those correspond to, your basic skill number. Half your skill number is hard. 1/5, it's an extreme difficulty, or extreme success, rather. And also, they show you, how to set the difficulty level according to the enemy characteristic if you're doing an opposed roll. They talk to you about how to work out success or failure, the uses of pushing a roll, and some examples of that. Foreshadowing consequences for a pushed roll is a really important thing for the keeper to do, that can help them make an informed decision, basically, rather than just saying, oh, you died because you pushed and failed. That's no fun. But if you push and fail, then you could give them a kind of hint what might happen because of the approach they're taking, and then follow through on that and make things much more difficult for them. So if you have a really bad failed dice roll, then they also encourage you to not have that lead to instant death, but maybe the investigator is taken captive, or maybe, the enemy offers some kind of deal of the devil, which they have to take, or the character might pass out and find themselves in a totally different situation. So there are ways to deal with sort of bad rolls that don't involve immediately destroying somebody's character that they've worked on. But, that is part of the Cthulhu experience, having character death as a real possibility, so don't go too far with that. You want players to feel that mortality is a real and ever-present possibility. Then we talk about opposed rolls, bonus and penalty dice, which we know about, combined skill rolls, so you want to use more than one skill in a situation. You will roll one dice, and then you compare with each of the skills that were named. It advises you how to set difficulty levels for things like charming, fast-talking, intimidating, persuading NPCs. There's so much good stuff in here for the keeper. And then, of course, the investigator development phase. So when you get to the end of the session and you want to check for skill improvement. And then how to use credit rating, spending money, contacts, the consequences of aging. If your character is going through a long campaign, or maybe they age through the effects of a spell or going through a gate or something, that will affect their attributes in different ways. Then we have the spending luck to try and pass your rolls. It's an optional rule technically, but basically I always use it because it's just more fun. It gives that extra little bit of momentum. The player might still make it. If we're just within a certain range, they have to then decide whether to use that limited resource. So at the end of each session, you do it the same way as skill improvement. You roll above your present luck score, then you can add 1d points to their luck. Otherwise, they don't recover any. Luck can never go above 99, by the way. Then we have a section on combat. Let's look at that horrible thing is eating that poor guy. She's grappling with a tentacle. He looks to be trying to shoot it. He's casting a spell. Some eyes are looking somewhat worried in that direction. A lot going on in these illustrations. So we go through the details of the combat round. And there are more options, of course, now, because in this full set of rules, we have things like more fighting maneuvers, possibility of casting spells, which was not in the starter set. But they have a lovely combat flowchart here to help you work out what you need to do. So that's handy. Then there's some more detail on firearms. So things like dealing with fast-moving targets, concealment, target size differences if you're firing against something huge or something tiny, firing into a melee combat, automatic fire, which is a little bit complicated compared to the other rules, but they give you a lovely example here of firearms combat, as well as multiple shots. There's plenty of examples basically throughout the book. So if you have any questions, I always would check the examples first before you run online to Reddit or something and see what you can find there. Usually the answer is right there in front of you. Then we have wounds and healing, damage, using medicine, first aid, major wound recovery, and we have a damage flow chart as well in case you need to help to navigate that process. And then there's some optional rules for combat. You can roll for initiative if you want. Basically, you roll against your dex and then use your success level, but it's a little bit more complicated. Then we have the table of the other forms of damage again. You can do knockout blows, so basically you're using a lethal weapon as a knockout maneuver, so you're hitting somebody with the handle of your pistol or butt of your rifle or whatever. And basically, just some tips on running combat and making it exciting. Suppressing fire, is another nice optional rule. Different ways of using armor, optional hit locations. I like using that as well. You use that in other games based on the same core system. So the core system of Cthulhu is called the Basic Role-Playing System, BRP. And in games like RuneQuest that use a deeper version of BRP, hit locations are a big part of the game. And I think it makes sense in Call of Cthulhu because it makes a big difference if you get shot in the abdomen or the chest or the head versus the leg or the arm, So that can be an interesting thing to add to the game, Give some movement penalties, for example, for different types of injuries, etc. Now we have some sample poisons, their effects for one dose, how fast they act, and some special notes. So everything from rohypnol to cyanide to belladonna. Very, very cool. Then we have a system just for chases, which happens surprisingly often, where you're running for your life, either on foot or by car or some other mode of transportation. So they tell you how to set up hazards for the chase, work out who's in front of whom, and how somebody might sort of try to beat those hazards and get away, or conversely, beat those hazards to get closer to their target if they're the chaser. It's really cool rules. They work really well. And once somebody catches up, then you can get into a conflict. And there are also optional rules here as well. You can have sudden hazards that pop up unexpectedly. You can roll for hazards. You can add additional options like just pumping the pedal to the metal, hiding once you escape the pursuer, and hoping they don't find you. Drivers taking damage and what that does. Switching between different modes of movement during chases. So vehicle reference charts, so movement rates for different vehicles, including air vehicles, heavy vehicles like tanks and trains, and other forms of transports like bicycles and horses, and some modern stuff like submarines, hovercraft, etc. Because basically the modern era rules are included along with the 1920 rules in these books. Then you can even do chases with multiple characters. I mean, they really get into it here with the examples, as you can see. You can get pretty interesting with it if you want to. I try to keep the chase elements a bit straightforward. And they actually use an example here from the story of Call of Cthulhu and how they would run it using the rules in the Keeper's Rulebook, which is great. Then we have a wonderful mood-setting picture for the chapter on sanity, which is great. Yeah, so nobody can have a sanity above 99, but the interesting part of that as well is that through certain happenstances, when you encounter things from the Mythos, you'll gain points in the Cthulhu Mythos skill, and that the value of Cthulhu Mythos skill is then subtracted to get your maximum sanity points. So you start at 99 maximum, and then as your Cthulhu Mythos skill goes up from 0 to whatever, your maximum sanity will go down in accordance with that. So the more you learn about the truth of the horrors of reality, the less sane you are sort of permanently. Your maximum sanity becomes lower and lower. And there's some example sanity point costs, which could be severe if you see something as bad as Great Cthulhu. Then things like indefinite insanity, permanent insanity. Again, we have the D10 roll for the Bounce of Madness. And they talk about insanity phase 2, where there's an underlying insanity. You get phobias and manias that can trigger different responses. And then we have a much expanded list of phobias and manias, which is fantastic. Look at all that. We've got 100 of each, so you can roll the D100 to pick one at random, or you can pick one that's appropriate for the situation. Then we have the delusions and reality checks that we saw as well in the starter rules, and some examples of what will be the effects on players of certain critical things like phobias, manias, compulsions, or amnesia. Recovery from insanity. So basically, you need to find psychiatric care or be institutionalized, and then you roll over time to see basically how much sanity you gain from week to week. So again, if you get committed to an asylum, it could be quite a while before you get back out. So you can also increase current sanity points. So at the end of a successful scenario, when you've prevailed, then you give a sanity point reward, and the player will gain some sanity back. Or if a character has increased a skill level to 90%, then you can award them 2d6 sanity points as a kind of recognition of that extra discipline and self-esteem they get from being a sort of worldwide master of a skill. You can gain sanity from psychotherapy, from self-help. Getting used to the awfulness, that's an interesting one. So you will never lose more than 6 sanity points for encountering deep ones, even if you saw 100 of them at the same time. And if you keep being exposed to the same thing, you kind of get inured to it. But if you spend some time having not seen that horrible thing, and then you see it again, you might still suffer the sanity loss. Then we have some cool optional rules, like getting Mythos hardened. At a certain point, a player will become so used to this kind of stuff, going crazy, that they will take sort of half sanity damage. You can also have multiple sanity rolls for certain things. Then we get into the basics of magic, which usually comes about by finding a Mythos tome and studying it for a really long time. You can make an initial reading to determine the basic contents, and then if you do a full study, then you can figure out things like spells and stuff like that. They tell you how to use magic, which is generally spending magic points, which depends on your POW, your strength of will, how you go about learning spells. You can also be given them from a Mythos entity, which is usually not something a PC would do, but something that like a cultist would do. And then the way you cast the spell is usually described in the description of the spell itself. And if you fail your roll to cast the spell, then there can be some side effects. So you roll a d8 on this table for smaller spells. For more powerful spells that go wrong, then things can get real bad, like the caster ages unnaturally plus 2d10 years. Powerful or numerous Mythos entities appear. The caster or everybody nearby are sucked to a distant time or place. Pretty bad stuff. So try not to fail your casting rolls. And people can obviously notice when you're casting a spell. If a spell is disrupted, then you can count that as like a failed casting roll. But if you are disrupted and fail the casting roll, you must still pay the sanity and magic point costs. So you can't escape those. Once you start casting, your sanity and MPs are gone, whether the result is successful or not. Then we have some optional rules. So, how you can spontaneous use of the Cthulhu Mythos skill to do certain things. There's some cool options in there. Then we have kind of the GM tips for new keepers, what you need to prepare for playing the game, advising players on creating investigators, depending on how they're generating them or what they're using pregens, how to play NPCs, role-playing them, getting role-playing hooks to get your players into an adventure, playing the authorities that they might encounter, using the character's backstory against them, corrupting backstories as a result of madness, rolling dice. So sometimes, you should roll the dice in full view, they recommend. But for certain roles that you want to keep to yourself, like for social interaction, for example, you roll that behind the screen. So like psychology or intimidate or stuff like that. It's not always going to be obvious if the attempt was successful, and you want that mystery. So those you would roll behind a screen. So pushing the roll is a possibility of pushing the horror. They talk about running verbal conflicts, dealing with violence and sanity rolls, how to pace the game well, keep the mystery kind of keeping players engaged, what to do if you have problem players, and the idea roll, which is great. I mean, sometimes your players get stuck. They have clues and they don't know what to do, so you can say, well, roll me an idea roll. So they roll, try to get below their intelligence characteristic, and then you can give them a clue. Basically, it may have been something they saw earlier, and they kind of just pick up in a flash of insight. It could be something that you just gift to them, or it could be something where you just help them tie together a couple pieces of evidence in the way they haven't thought of yet as a group. But there's different difficulty costs depending on what kind of idea roll they want to do. Yeah, I mean this chapter is invaluable both for new and for experienced keepers. I think especially obvious clues and obscured clues. Making sure that like dice rolls don't gate content behind them. So, players fail all the rolls they need to find a clue, make sure there's another way for them to get key information, stuff like that. Guides to using the rules for specific scenarios, like being in a casino, ambushing somebody, swimming to safety, strangling people, running action scenes, presenting the terrors of the mythos in appropriately noxious fashion, dealing with failed sanity rolls, helping players portray that in their characters, and how to scare the players, which is always part of the fun. And then dealing with magic as well. And then how to deal with the end of a story, investigator death, and then some basic ideas for creating scenarios that fit the mythos. There's our friend Nyarlathotep. Yeah, and using Lovecraftian themes. So again, the fear of the alien, the outsider, cosmic horror, fear of corruption, the cold and dead universe doesn't care about us, all that kind of stuff. And then, the difference between a linear scenario where players have a clear path through, and the non-linear scenario where they can sort of go from place to place freely to pick up clues. That can be harder to run for a new keeper, but it can be a lot of fun for your players. Then we get into Tomes of Eldritch Lore, so we're getting to more detailed stuff now, which I'll skip a little bit more. So this is just lists of key books in the mythos that can be found by players. The appropriate sanity loss for reading it, what you'll gain in your Cthulhu mythos skill, what mythos rating you'll need to comprehend it fully, and possible spells that you could get from a full reading of the book. Some players complain that the study times are a bit too long. I think that can be the case. Like it's 48 weeks for De Vermis Mysteriis. That's a long time. That's almost a year. But, you can play with that. You're the keeper. It's your game. So, do what you need to do to make the game work for you. Then we also have just plain old occult books that are not specifically mythos related, but kind of have useful things in them. That includes stuff like the Zohar, the I Ching, the Malleus Maleficarum. These are real books, by the way. And then we have a nice summary table of the mythos tomes that you can reference, which goes on and on. There's quite a few of them. Then we have the Grimoire. So this is where we have some key spells, so the rules for using magic in play, getting a bit deeper into magic rules with this, and, creating sort of versions of different spells. So, a variant of the Grey Binding, which is a create zombie spell, and then, other ways to create variant spells. You can make them more macabre and disgusting. How you deal with call and contact spells, where you contact mythos entities. Yeah, and now we have spells listed sort of alphabetically. Things like Blessing Blade, Breath of the Deep, so you can fill a target's lungs with seawater, causing a death by drowning. That's fun. You can call and dismiss deities, which is a very risky business, causing and curing blindness, clouding someone's memory, take over someone's likeness, take over the appearance of a victim. You can contact various mythos creatures with different amounts of magic points and sanity points being spent. You can contact mythos deities as well, which is very risky, of course. You can create barriers for physical and magical defense. You can make zombies, there's death spell, domination spells, the Elder Sign. You draw it as a defense to monsters or minions, but it has to be done in such a way that they can't avoid it by just walking around it or whatever. So if you just wear one around your neck, it'll protect like your neck, but not the rest of your body. So you got to consider stuff like that with these spells. There's always some tricks to these. Enchantment spells will enhance objects that you have. Gate spells are really cool because you can use them to travel insane distances. even to other locations in space. Like here we have, if you have 55 POW and you spend 11 magic points, you could travel, what is that, 1 trillion miles? Quite a few. And we get up into light years as you get higher and higher. So the more your POW, the farther you can travel. And there are, of course, other planets that play a role in the Cthulhu mythos. Then we've got yet more enchantments. We've got crazy stuff like mind transfer, where you swap minds with a target. Mind exchange. Resurrection, which is always risky. Summoning spells. So here we can summon and bind servitors of the outer gods. Hunting horrors, night gaunts, all that kind of cool stuff. And then we have a chapter on artifacts and alien devices. We have some sidebars as well on some of the alien races that are part of the Cthulhu mythos, like the Migo, who are an antagonist in some cool campaigns and adventures. They like to put your brains in cylinders, hence the name Brain Cylinder. And it tells you as well which race is using these different items. So the Domination Serum is used by the Serpent People. The Electric Gun is used by the Migo. The Great White Space is used by the Elder Things, and it's basically a sort of pocket dimension. So there's lots of interesting and wild stuff in here. The Great Race of Yith use lightning guns, which are really deadly. So when you're getting into the pretty wild end of the mythos, you'll start to use stuff like that. Now we have the Bestiary, which is great. We've got a nice size comparison chart as well. So there's a regular guy. He's very tiny. We have the Monstrous Dole, which is kind of like a sandworm from Dune. Got some typical creatures like the Night Gaunts, some Elder and Gods and Outer Gods like Nyarlathotep and Nyogtha, bigger monsters like the Flying Polyps, Ithaqua, another god, Yog-Sothoth, who's just ginormous, Great Cthulhu, who is also ginormous, the Dark Young of Shub-Niggurath, which is a very, very deadly creature. That's one thing about this game is people start to feel comfortable in the early days when they, you break up a cult and your guns are very effective, but when you start getting deeper and deeper into the mythos, your guns start to not help so much. You start having to do really risky things like trying to break up rituals while they're being done by a huge number of cult members, or running away from a mythos entity that is tracking you mercilessly, or trying to take them down with spells of your own that cost sanity and all kinds of stuff. And then we get into the stats and details of key creatures from the mythos. Of course, this was all expanded in the Malleus Maleficarum 2-book expansion, which has a huge number of creatures and gods that you can throw against your players. But a lot of stuff that'll be familiar to fans of Lovecraft, like Dimensional Shamblers and Elder Things, are in here already. But if you really want to get deep with it, get nasty with your players, basically everything in the mythos, even by newer authors in that sort of style of writing, is included in those new books, which is pretty cool. You got Flying Polyps, you got Fire Vampires, Formless Spawn, Ghouls, Servants of Glaki, the Great Race of Yith, who are these sort of tetrahedron-looking dudes, Hounds of Tindalos, which are, of course, one from the stories, Hunting Horrors, which are nasty, the Loigor, Migo, the fungi from Yugoth, Yugoth being Pluto, by the way, Night Gaunts, Rat Things, Sand Dwellers, the Serpent People, there's an example there, lovely illustrations as well. Servitors of the Outer Gods, so they're the kind of mad pipers that surround things like Azathoth. The insects from Shagai. We've got the infamous Shoggoth, whom we meet, I think, at the Mountains of Madness. Shoggoth Lords. We've got Starspawn of Cthulhu, Star Vampires, the Chocho, who are kind of a savage cult. Then we've got Section 2, which is the deities. And these are quite interesting because, they're, first of all, it's very unlikely you can kill them. They can be physically assaulted and driven back, but they will sort of reform themselves over time. So, for example, here, Abhoth, if he's reduced to 0 hit points, it withdraws and sinks far away down into the earth, where it is inaccessible to further damage. It oozes toward the surface after healing from its injuries. So you can put these gods away for a time, if you're very, very fortunate. But they are extremely dangerous, and some of them you really can't do much about. So, for example, if Azathoth actually manifests, its constitution is 1500, it has 300 hit points, 100 magic points. If you dispel Azathoth, you can return at full strength in 1d6 hours. You can do 1d 100 hit points in damage when he hits you with a tentacle. So you're pretty much screwed if you meet some of these gods. Great Cthulhu is no exception. Of course, they've got a really interesting design for him in this book, which I like as well. He's got strength 700, con 550, size 1050, damage bonus plus 21d6. So, one swipe with a claw and you'll just be splattered. Each round, 1d3 investigators are scooped up in Cthulhu's flabby claws to die hideously. So, the gods will just basically murder people willy-nilly. So you really want them to be the climax of a long campaign. It's a big build-up, and then you've got to have something in your back pocket to try and get rid of them, at least for a time, because otherwise you are in the deep shit, as they say. We got all the key gods in here. Athaqua, Glaki, the King in Yellow, Nodens, Nyarlathotep. Again, nice illustration there. Nyogtha, Ran-Tagoth, Trubnigarath. Fortunate name, somewhat. Sathogwa is a good one. Yeah, Ubosathla, who's worshipped by the Chocho tribe. Igolanak, who's got a weird headless body with... It's a bit sort of like in the Hellraiser movies. You know, they always have weird spikes and stuff sticking out of them. The hell beasts from Hellraiser. We got Yeg, who's the god of the serpent people. Yog-Sothoth, the opener of the way. Again, really not one you want to fight. And then we got traditional horrors as well. They don't have to be... Not every adventure has to be a mythos adventure. So you can do ghost stories, mummy stories, skeletons, vampires, werewolves. You got zombies. Then you got regular beasts like big bats, vampire bats, bears, crocodiles, dogs, wolves, horses, lions, sharks, snakes, giant squid even. And some optional rules as well, if you want to have a little bit more structure to how the mythos works in your setting. And then we have the beginner scenarios, which I'll flip through at speed as usual. But they're really, really well done. Plenty of guidance for the keeper, all illustrated. The first one's quite short, as you can see, and the second one gets into a bit more detail. So, a worthy follow-up. And then we have all of our appendices. So, the glossary of key game terms, converting to 7th edition rules from previous editions, which basically multiply a lot of things by 5. It's not really difficult. Then equipment lists in the 1920s for key stuff like clothing, tools, vehicles, transport, etc. Medical gear, travel, weapons and ammo, melee weapons, and the same again for the modern day, along with some illustrations. We've got a handy weapons table when you're just worried about combat. So there are a lot of actual different types of, handguns, rifles, shotguns, assault rifles, submachine guns, machine guns, etc. in this game. And you can buy some really nice supplements as well on Drive-Thru RPG to get even more detail in your firearms if you want. And then you got the summary of melee combat, summary of fighting maneuvers, summary of, what do we got? Full auto fire, other forms of damage, the 2 combat flowcharts, the summary of the chase rules, vehicle reference chart, summary of sanity rules, summary of magic rules, some keywords that Lovecraft liked to use, so you can use these in your descriptions, and then your index. So, you can see just how comprehensive, it's a real thick piece of work. There's a lot in there, but a lot of it is just guidance and background and great ideas for GMing, as well as 2 excellent scenarios. And as you can see, they've given you great summaries of all the major parts of the rules at the end there that you can reference as and when you need. All right, next we'll take a quick look at the Keeper, or the Investigator Handbook, This one you'll see is substantially thinner because we don't have Bestiaries and Grimoires and that. That's for the Keeper only. So this is more for the player rather than the GM. Although, I've done both sides, so I own both books. So here we focus more on, the creating investigators. There's some more occupations and skill stuff, some sample organizations that you can be part of as an investigator, what your life is going to be like as an investigator. And then there's some great background info on the Roaring Twenties, a full 42 pages of that. Then some setting advice and rules advice, some key reference stuff like the Lovecraft Country, different weapons, travel times, things that you would need to know as a person living in that era. And then some investigator sheets. So it's really focused on what you need as a player. Again, we have the typical, what's a role-playing game, what dice do I need kind of stuff. Then we have some background story stuff, the Dunwich Horror. Just to kind of get you into the setting. Goes on for a little while here. Some illustrations along with it. And then we jump into character creation. So we've kind of been through this already, so we won't spend much time on that. But again, lovely examples for the players to use. How to decide and allocate your skill points, what all your stuff means, even tables for picking a sort of sensible name for the period. My dog used to be called Dudley, so I like to use Dudley for a character name. He was the dog I had when I was a kid. Using your cash and assets, the alternative methods, blah, blah, blah. The map of the character sheet, which we know. Then we've got some occupations. There's some additional ones here compared to the Keeper Rulebook. And they're explored in a bit more detail because you as the player need to be role-playing this. Right? It's not just a set of skills and stuff. It's like, what do you do as a foreign correspondent, as a gangster, as a gentleman, as a lawyer, whatever. So they give you that additional background, which is really helpful. You can be a union activist. Hooray, that's me in real life. Now we've got more info on skills, which again, we've kind of been through already, but this is more from a player's point of view. You'll see that there's examples of pushing, but no examples of setting difficulties. So again, this is specifically for the player's point of view. Keeper tips are not included, but there are some additional stuff to help players out. Investigator Organizations chapter is really good, but it helps for investigators to work out, how they're connected, to tell a kind of backstory, to have a group concepts. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we sharing this interest in uncovering the true horror of reality? What do we get from it? And there's a few examples. The Society for the Explanation of the Unexplained I've used a lot. It's a informal group based at Miskatonic University in the city of Arkham, Massachusetts. It's a great sort of default setting that's in the starter set, so I often just develop from that. Then we have some example characters, who they are, who their significant people are, what they do, and their background, how they got into the mythos. And yeah, so it's just, lots of examples here to give you an idea of how to situate your character in the world, give them a reason to be doing all this stuff. And one thing I always remind my players as well is that you have to engage with the setting. It is a horror setting, right? So you go towards the horror, not away from it. The sensible thing would be to not go into the house with the strange noises and the lights shooting out into the sky, into space. But you're not a sensible person. You're an investigator. You want to find out the truth, no matter how horrible it is. So, you have to engage with that part, And most people have no problem doing that. But if they don't want to run into the haunted house, maybe this game is not for them. Then we have a great bit of detail here on the Society for the Exploration of the Unexplained. So some of these people you will recognize from the starter set, like Avebury. And there's some new people as well. Then the basics of life on the internet. So on the internet, life as an investigator. So how you would go about investigating things. You're going to use resources like newspapers, libraries, civic records, the internet if you're in the modern day. Looking in cemetery records, church records, investigating on site, taking photographs, talking to witnesses, using your contacts, bribing people, surveilling people, doing stakeouts, tactical considerations like making sure somebody's watching over you if you know that you're in danger. You have a watch system in place. Make sure you have somebody that knows how to use weapons. If you're going to be using spells, make sure that you know that they take time to cast. They can be very unfortunate if you screw up your casting, and they're hard to hide as well. Using disguises and stealth can also be really helpful. Having a system of coded communication. In the modern era, you could do it with cell phones and stuff, but they're also trackable, so you got to be careful with that. And then some examples about, different types of team compositions that are useful for the typical adventuring party, and standard equipment that people should have, like automobiles, lighting sources, stuff like that. Planning for the future, so maybe you pick up like a protege or an associate who you kind of initiate into the society in case somebody dies. They kind of take their place or whatever. Making a will, making a plan for retirement. These can all help when a character is knocked out of the game and somebody needs to take their place. And now we have a 2-page spread version of the sizing chart, which we saw in the GM's book. So helpful for the players to realize that, some of the threats they're facing are pretty damn serious. So, you don't want to mess around. You need to take the tips in the book seriously. We have a great introduction here to the Roaring Twenties, with both cultural history, the chronology in terms of major world events, but also individual stuff like trends, the type of transports that were being in use, the level of firearms restrictions, driving restrictions, and capabilities, and also in different places like in the UK. The level of forensics equipment that was available in the 20s, which is very helpful. They didn't have the technologies we have today. There's no CSI back then. And then outfitting your investigator. So, key things to have. Electric torches, gas lanterns, flares, binoculars, field glasses, a camera for capturing evidence, maybe even a film camera if you can afford it. Typical vehicles of the time. So the Ford Model T, the Tin Lizzie, that's the most sort of freely available, but it's also not super fast. There are faster cars available, but they're much more expensive. Of course, there are other forms of transport. They give you a list of period cars and trucks, their prices, how many they can seat, their build rating, their movement speed, and how much armor they give to passengers. Then there's, a few private aircraft, seaplanes, there's air taxi services, and there's some details about that. And then we get into firearms, what was available at the time. They go into much more detail on the equipment, again, in this book than in the GM book. GM just needs to know what dice he's rolling when somebody's shooting at his monsters or whatever. As a player, it's more engaging to know what your gun actually looks like, what it can do, what it costs, how it feels to hold and wield and stuff like that. And then we got some examples of super famous people at the time. Explorers like Ernest Shackleton, Roald Amundsen, designers like Salvador Dali, Frank Lloyd Wright, film stars, authors, businessmen, athletes like Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey, the boxer, famous religious figures, criminal figures, Bonnie and Clyde, for example, famous journalists, famous pop culture stuff, union activists even, law enforcement people. There's just so much great background here to help you get yourself into the setting. And then, even great scholars and occultists like A.E. Waite, Aleister Crowley, Charles Fort, Edward Case, the prophet and mystic, Harry Price, the parapsychologist. And then in science, we have people like Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison. They really do a great job of giving you that sense of place in the 1920s. And then we get into player advice. So how you should roleplay, how you should cooperate with your team, the expectations that you should have of a scenario and a setting. Don't rely on guns. That's very important. First of all, some big monsters don't care about gunshots. Secondly, they're very loud, and you can be attracting unwanted attention from authorities, from associates of whoever you're shooting at. So be careful. Guns are valuable and damaging, but they can also put you in a very bad position. Keeping track of stuff as well. As a player, you're responsible for, keeping track of what skills you used and ticking the boxes, contributing to the game with, bringing snacks or drinks or whatever, or helping out with bookkeeping and stuff like that if you're doing online play. And then rules advice, when you should roll dice, when you shouldn't, how you should narrate things when you do well, advice on pushing your rolls, social interactions, and how to deal with when you're doing a social interaction kind of both as a role and as a role playing, so it can be difficult for people to get their head around. Using your skills and contacts, idea rolls, how to get into fights and not die. Dealing with insanity and role playing it. Dealing with the lowering of your sanity as you gain more familiarity with the mythos. And then we've got a load of great player reference. So we've got, again, our chronology from 1890, going all the way up through to the modern day, I believe. 2012. Yeah, this version was published in 2013, so probably they've updated that timeline by now. Speeds and distances for aircraft, horseback, cars, and then equipment, travel, and weapon cost by period. So, again, very helpful. And they have some sample adverts for housing and stuff from the time, which is really cool. The cost of accessories for vehicles, and then the same again for the modern day. So, computers, like outdoor gear, motor vehicles, all that kind of stuff, and all the stats that you need, which is great. And then some guidelines for, this is converting previous edition characters to the current one, which again is very simple to do. And then we've got some useful maps of Lovecraft Country, Arkham, Massachusetts, but things are not labeled really except for the streets. So these are kind of player safe maps. The GM maps have more detail. And then we got your index and Kickstarter backers. So again, fantastic for the player. It's got everything you need and nothing you don't. And they really go to the max as far as making sure you have all the info you need to role play in your best possible way. Finally, we have the Call of Cthulhu Keeper screen. Again, this is actually a lot more than a Keeper screen. So we have two fantastic adventures in here, Mist Dews and Blackwater Creek. We've got some pre-gens for them at the back, as you can see, which is very handy. And then the two adventures themselves, I think they've both been reviewed by Seth Skorkowski. So if you're a GM, always check Seth Skorkowski's channel. If he's run the adventure, he'll have great tips on things that, troubles you might run into, how to run it well, make sure that your players have a good time, etc. He's really good for that. So don't look to tips from me. I just want to show you the products and tell you what you get for your money and tell you my feelings about things. We've got some stats for NPCs and stuff. But yeah, I really enjoyed running both these adventures. You can see they're quite a bit more, in depth in certain ways. And there's a lot of cool handouts as well. Again, this is where having the PDF version is useful because you can print those out to your heart's content. Then we have some really useful keeper reference stuff in this resource handbook. So the quickfire method for character creation, if somebody dies, reference for the skill points, what they mean, level of education, what that means, the base chances for every skill, the sample phobias, sample poisons, all the possible manias as well, a reference to key mythos tomes, weapons tables, including handguns, shotguns, rifles, and then the modern day stuff as well, and a key to certain specific aspects of weapons that are noted in the tables. So that's a really useful reference to keep around you as well. Then we got some cool maps. So what do we got here? This is the overall map of the Lovecraftian world. So we have key mythos locations in different parts of the world. So some are like under the sea or underground in various different places. You got Greenland. There's stuff going on in Antarctica, Aurelia, buried out near Easter Island somewhere. Plateau of Lang in Asia, the mythical Shambhala, Yan, all these interesting locations to set mythos-inspired adventures. Then you've got the maps that we saw in the Investigator's Handbook. So we have the Lovecraft Country map done with really nice poster-style paper. And yeah, we've got just a little bit more detail here, basically. So some additional bits of villages and stuff marked out, and giving you an overall sense of where you are in Massachusetts. So Arkham relative to Boston and the other areas that are key here, like Ipswich, Gloucester, Salem, etc. And then we have a somewhat difficult to use map of Arkham. There are some better ones, in my opinion, in the old Arkham supplement for previous editions. So I've given those to my players when they're in Arkham, because it's got this huge border, and the actual town, it's like kind of hard to see the streets and stuff. It does look nice. I like the look of it, but I think the border is just a bit too big. They should have expanded this out a little bit. It's really my only complaint about this set, to be honest with you. And the fact that, they're doing another Arkham supplement for the 7th edition update soon. Well, soonish. We know it's in development anyway. Then we have some blank character sheets, all done on really nice sort of laminated feeling paper. So, you can throw these out when your player dies and needs something additional. Then we have some handouts for adventures and maps that are in the adventures book. And then after all that, we have the actual screen itself. So we'll look at the artwork side first. As you would imagine, it's setting a fairly dark atmosphere. We've got an investigator running from a tentacle thing in the forest. Got a mysterious, I don't know, I can't tell if that's a figure or not. There's a nice sense of nebulousness in the forest here. We got what looks like a team of investigators armed up, supplying themselves with stuff. Another team over here with a 1920s car. Got some torches, and basically everybody's going to try and go into this scary looking old-ass temple. So yeah, pretty much sums up the Call of Cthulhu experience. And then on the inside, we've got all the nice key tables that a GM, or a keeper rather, needs. So determining difficulty levels, bonus and penalty dice, comparing results, investigator development phase to run at the end of the session, the living standards according to credit rating, different forms of damage, key rules about firearms and armor values, resolving automatic fire and resolving attacks in general, and resolving semi-automatic fire if you have that capability. We've got a miniature version of the combat flowchart, which is really useful. Human limits plus assisting rules if a PCA wants to help somebody out and help them do something. We've got the bounce of madness tables as well. The different phases of insanity. Example sanity costs for key creatures. Some rules references for spells and tomes. And then on the last panel here we have insanity effects, a summary of the chase rules, including the setup, sample barriers, and dealing with hazards, barriers, and combat during a chase. And then you have the damage diagram as well. A summary of vehicular collisions and the damage they do. A reminder of how major wounds heal and what happens when your vehicle is damaged to different levels. So pretty much everything you need to run a typical game. There will be some details, particularly in some unusual combat or chase situations, where you'll need to reference the main rulebook. But for the most part, you can get by with this, plus that summary booklet that you find in the beginning of this pack. This is one to fold up. I guess it needs to go this way. There we go. So yeah, the GM kit is absolutely fantastic because it's much more than just the screen. The screen is value enough on its own for most games, but here they give you all this stuff. You know, spare character sheets on nice paper and 2 great adventures, plus handouts, plus big maps, poster-sized maps. So the Slipcase set is a fantastic value. I think it's currently listed at $119. So that's why, you know, I paid $100 on the Kickstarter, plus whatever the shipping cost was at the time. I can't remember, but it wasn't very much because they had a UK warehouse. But I mean, you get everything you need to play years worth of games. You've got 4 scenarios because you've got 2 starter scenarios in the Keeper Rulebook, 2 in the Keeper screen. If you've got the starter set as well, you've got 4 scenarios in there. So you've got plenty to get you on your way. So there's really, I mean, buying these things individually costs more than the Slipcase set. So just get the Slipcase set would be my recommendation. If you play the starter set and you want more, just buy this right off the bat and then think about, you know, where you might want to take your players in the future. I will be coming back to show you some videos about the really, really excellent supplements that are available for this game, like Harlem, Berlin, the Wicked City, you know, all this kind of stuff. And some of the different time periods as well, like the Dark Ages, Down Darker Trails, which is the Wild West setting, all that kind of stuff. So look forward to that. But yeah, it's a fantastic set of books. I mean, they've lasted me 10 years, and as you can see, everything is still basically flawless. There's a bit of shelf wear on the edge of my slipcase, and that's really it. The books are like, they still function as new, basically. So you won't regret the purchase, and Chaosium always ships everything really, really nicely packed as well, in my experience. Plus, they have excellent customer service. If you have any problem with a product, they often just send out a complete replacement, even if it's a tiny little thing. So can't thank them enough for what they've done in the past for me as far as customer service. And they also give you all the PDFs immediately on purchase. So then you know, they ship out quickly, generally speaking, and you will get a high quality product. So anyway, I hope that was useful for you guys. We're looking to get into Cthulhu. I love this game so much. 7th edition is absolutely fantastic. It just polishes to a fine sheen, a system that's been the source of fantastic gameplay for more than 40 years. I think we're up to 43 years at this point. And I hope it'll bring us many, many more years of enjoyment, and I'm sure it will. And again, these are slightly older versions of the books. They may have more updates in the latest version that I haven't seen yet, but this will at least give you an idea of what you get, because it will be very, very close to this with just, I think, some minor fixes rather than extensive ones. So in any case, look forward to more Call of Cthulhu videos in the future. Let me know in the comments what you think about the set. If you have any opinions about the later printings, whether I should bother to upgrade or not, that'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, stay well, protect your sanity, and I hope to see you in the next video. All right, take care, and bye-bye.